They once believed the stars were gentle. The Velcari, beings of glass and light, thought the universe was a poem written in radiance. On their world, Etherian, everything shimmered with delicate purpose. The forests were crystalline and sang when the wind moved through their branches. The rivers glowed faintly at night, carrying soft trails of light over stones that refracted color into every passing breeze. Even the air itself seemed to hum with peace. The Velcari did not have a word for cruelty. They had left such concepts behind ages ago. They were artists, philosophers, and healers. They could paint with wavelengths of color unseen by most eyes, compose music designed to ripple through atmospheres, and communicate emotion by shifting the hue of their translucent wings. Their language was beauty, and their faith was harmony. For thousands of years, they thrived in that serenity, until curiosity led them upward, until the galaxy called. When the Galactic Council reached out, the Velcari answered. They believed in unity, in shared wisdom, in the idea that peace could stretch across the stars. And for a while, it seemed true. Their emissaries were welcomed. Their art was adored. Their shimmering wings became symbols of purity and grace. Every other species used the same words to describe them: delicate, ethereal, fragile. That was the beginning of the misunderstanding. Because in the galaxy's vast ecosystem, fragility is often mistaken for weakness. And when the Velcari came to Station Kepler 442, that misunderstanding became pain. The station was meant to be a beacon of progress, a floating academy orbiting a dead moon, home to the brightest students from 17 star systems. It was a city of light, education, and interspecies diplomacy. In practice, it was chaos and bureaucratic wrapping. The strong dominated by habit, the ambitious competed for notice, and those who valued peace found themselves ignored, or worse, mocked. The drool species towered over most others, reptilian and immense, scales glinting like armor. The Kryn, armored in chitin, saw themselves as the pinnacle of evolution. The Thoraxians, brilliant insectoid engineers, filled the air with constant chatter. And the Velcari, luminous, quiet, and featherlight, were treated like ornaments. And then, humanity arrived. The humans had been late to the galactic party, the newest species in the council, but also the most confusing. They had no claws, no natural armor, no biological weapons. And yet, when the Kresh Empire had tested their defenses, humanity sent back wreckage, and a polite message asking if the Kresh would like to discuss trade. The council still whispered about that. Humans, they said, were paradoxes, civilized predators, builders from a death world, friendly until provoked, and then unstoppable. So when human students arrived on Kepler Station, curiosity filled the halls. Some species were fascinated. Some were wary. A few were quietly terrified. Among them walked a Velcari student named Zerth, as the humans would later call her. She was young, even by Velcari standards, her wings a translucent lattice of pale silver that shimmered when she breathed. She hadn't wanted to come. Her parents had begged her to. "You'll show them who we are," her mother had said, pressing a glowing palm to her cheek. "You'll remind them that gentleness is not weakness." Zerth wanted to believe that, but 3 months on Kepler Station had eroded that faith. Every morning she woke early, bound her wings tight against her back so no one could touch them, and walked the same long corridor to class. Every morning, her steps echoed in silence. Every morning, the drool student named Gra found her. It always began the same way, mocking words tossed casually through the air. Little moth, glass doll, winged toy. And then, when no one stopped him, the words turned to hands. His claws brushed her wings, too rough, too heavy, too cruel. The Velcari's wings were delicate membranes of light and nerve, meant for display, not defense. When they cracked, the pain seared like fire through her whole body. She would stumble, trembling, as the corridor filled with onlookers. No one helped. No one spoke. No one wanted to get involved. And she learned a word her people had never truly understood before: humiliation. She healed quickly. Her kind always did, but each time left a deeper wound. Not in flesh, in spirit. One night, after another day of laughter echoing behind her, she sat alone in her dormitory. The stars beyond the viewport flickered like distant glass shards. The transfer form glowed on her screen. Reason for withdrawal? it asked. Her fingers hovered. Then she typed a single word. Unfit. Her throat tightened as she stared at it. Maybe she was. Maybe her kind didn't belong out here, among predators. Maybe the universe had room only for the strong. Then she heard a voice behind her. Hey. She turned. A human girl stood in the doorway. Dark hair pulled back. Uniform crisp but unremarkable. Expression calm but sharp. Her eyes caught Zerth first. Human eyes, forward-facing, alive with quiet calculation. Not cruel. Not cold. Just focused. The kind of gaze that measured the world, not to judge it, but to understand how to survive it. Are you okay? The girl asked, stepping closer. Zerth's voice cracked. I'll heal. That's not what I asked. The human crouched beside her, scanning the trembling wings, the cracks glowing faintly in the dim light. She said nothing for a moment, and in that silence, Zerth felt seen in a way she hadn't in months. My name's Andrea, the girl said finally. I've been watching. 3 months now. No one does anything. Zerth's stomach twisted. Then you know to stay away. I'm not worth the trouble. Andrea's jaw tightened. Her voice dropped to a quiet calm that felt heavier than shouting. Who decides that? Him? The others? She leaned back, expression unreadable. Where I come from, we have a saying. All that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Zerth blinked. Your world sounds violent. Andrea's lips curved slightly. Oh, it is. We spent thousands of years perfecting the art of breaking things, including each other. Then, almost gently, she offered a hand. Come on, let's get you to class. Zerth hesitated. No one had offered to touch her wings, her hands, anything, not since the bullying began. Her instincts screamed to withdraw, but something in Andrea's posture, not dominance, not pity, just presence, made her trust the gesture. She took the hand. It was warm, solid, real. And for the first time since arriving on Kepler Station, Zerth felt anchored to something that didn't hurt. That moment was small, a simple human kindness. But the universe would remember it. Because the next morning, when the drool waited again, the girl with the predator eyes would be waiting too. And the stars themselves would learn what it meant when a fragile being met a human who refused to look away. The next morning began the same way it always had. Silver corridors, pale lights spilling from the overhead glass panels, and the endless, echoing hum of Kepler Station. But for the first time in months, Zerth didn't walk alone. Andrea walked beside her. Calm, steady, every step deliberate. She carried no weapon, no armor, not even a datapad. Just that same quiet composure that made the air around her feel different, heavier somehow, alive with unspoken warning. Zerth's wings trembled slightly under her robes. You don't have to come, she whispered. Andrea didn't look at her. I know. You'll make yourself a target. Maybe, Andrea said. But that's the thing about targets. Sometimes they shoot back. The words were strange, almost careless. But there was something ancient behind them, something shaped by survival. Zerth didn't understand it yet, but she would. They turned a corner, and there he was, GRA, the drool adolescent, massive, armored in scales that shimmered like molten bronze. His grin spread wide across his face when he saw her. The other drool stood behind him, a semicircle of muscle and cruelty. Morning, little moth, he said, his voice dripping amusement. Brought a friend this time? Andrea said nothing. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed, posture loose. To anyone else, she looked relaxed. But something in her stillness made even the air hesitate. GRA stepped forward, massive claws flexing. You think hiding behind a predator will help you? Andrea tilted her head slightly. That depends, she said softly. Do you plan on giving me a reason to move? He laughed. It was a deep, ugly sound. The kind of laughter meant to remind the smaller creature what power sounded like. He reached out toward Zerth's wings, just as he always did, slow, deliberate, confident that no one would ever stop him. He never finished the motion. Andrea moved. Zerth barely saw it. One heartbeat, GRA's hand was in the air. The next, his massive body crashed sideways into the wall with a sound like metal splitting. The impact echoed through the corridor. For a moment, everyone froze. Andrea stepped back, calm, her face unreadable. Sorry, she said, voice light as breath. Reflex. The other drool shifted uncertainly. Their species prized dominance, and this wasn't supposed to happen. A human, small, soft-skinned, no claws, no scales, had just dropped one of them in a single movement. It didn't make sense. Jare roared, trying to stand, but Andrea didn't flinch. "You should sit back down," she said quietly. "You'll find the floor's a good teacher." Another drool stepped forward, bigger, angrier. His claws flexed. From the shadows of the hall, a deeper voice spoke. "I wouldn't." A second human detached himself from the wall, tall, broad-shouldered, dark eyes calm and assessing. Jeremy. His stance was casual, but his weight was balanced perfectly over his feet, the way warriors carry themselves when violence is an option, not a goal. The drool hesitated. Something instinctive told them that these two didn't need size to win. 15 seconds later, the corridor was silent. Zerth stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she'd seen. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't brawling. It was precision. Humans didn't fight like beasts. They fought like problem solvers. Every motion was controlled, measured, efficient. A sequence of solutions written in muscle memory. Gra groaned, clutching his jaw. Andrea crouched beside him, not cruelly, but with cold clarity. "Here's how this works now," she said softly. "You don't touch her. You don't talk to her. You don't even think about her. Because if you do, I'll remind you just how creative humans can get when we're angry." Gra's voice wavered. "You can't threaten me. Academy rules." Andrea smiled. It wasn't pleasant. "Go ahead," she said. "File a report. I'll be here every morning after that." "Humans don't quit. Ask the Kresh Empire." He froze. The name hung in the air like a ghost story. Everyone had heard the rumors about the fleet that had tested humanity and vanished without a trace. The drool backed away slowly, dragging their pride with them. The corridor that had once been filled with laughter and fear now felt like something new, like the air after lightning, charged with possibility. Andrea turned to Zerth. "You okay?" Zerth's voice trembled. "Why did you do that?" Andrea tilted her head. "Because someone should have done it 3 months ago. But you could have been expelled." Andrea shrugged. "Maybe. But where I come from, we don't let bullies win. Doesn't matter what planet we're on." Zerth's wings flickered faintly, light trembling across their edges. "You don't even know me." Andrea's expression softened. "I didn't need to." For a long time, neither spoke. Around them, the corridor slowly filled with whispers, students of every species watching from a distance, murmuring, recalibrating what they thought they knew about humans. Predators, yes, but predators who protected. That night, the story traveled faster than the station's official news feed. Someone recorded it. Someone shared it. And within a day, 1,000 versions of the encounter were spreading through the Academy networks. The Velcari's protector. That's what they started calling her. The fragile species, the smaller ones, the ones who'd learned to survive through avoidance, began walking differently. A little taller, a little prouder. The drool, once so loud, grew silent in the hallways. Even the Kryn, ever arrogant, kept their distance when Andrea passed. Zerth found herself breathing again. She still walked the same corridors every morning. But now she felt the space around her shift, eyes no longer mocking, but curious. Respectful. Afraid, maybe, but in a way that meant safety. She began sitting with Andrea at meals. Quietly at first, unsure what to say. Humans, she learned, were strange. They laughed easily, but their humor often hid something deeper, a history written in struggle. When Andrea spoke of Earth, she described a world that sounded half nightmare, half miracle. A planet that tried to kill them every day, and a species too stubborn to die. Zerth listened in awe. She had grown up on a world of perfect light. Andrea had grown up on a world of predators, disease, storms, and fire. And somehow, humanity had turned all that pain into progress. "You've destroyed yourselves so many times," Zerth said once, while they studied in the library. "How are you still here?" Andrea smiled faintly. "Because every time we fall, someone decides to stand up. Sometimes it's a soldier. Sometimes it's a scientist. Sometimes it's just a kid in a hallway." Zerth looked down, her wings glowing softly in thought. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," Andrea said. "But simple isn't the same as easy." The next few weeks felt different. Gra avoided her. The drool gave her space. Zerth found her confidence slowly returning. She began contributing more in class, her voice steady, her answers thoughtful. The professors noticed. Her scores improved. She even began to laugh again. But not everyone approved. The academy administration called Andrea in. The incident had drawn attention, and attention meant scrutiny. The officials were careful with their words, formal, distant, hiding behind regulation. Violence, they said. Unacceptable. Dangerous. Unbecoming of an interspecies representative. Andrea listened without expression. When they finished, she leaned forward slightly. "And what did you do?" she asked quietly. "When a student was assaulted every morning for 3 months straight." The room fell silent. The officials exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. The silence was the answer. Andrea stood. "Then maybe you should worry less about who threw the punch, and more about why no one else ever did." She left before they could reply. No punishment came. No commendation either. But policies began to change, quietly, discreetly. Security monitoring increased. New anti-bullying protocols appeared in the rulebook. None of them mentioned her name. They didn't have to. Everyone knew why. Andrea never brought it up again. She never boasted, never gloated. When students tried to thank her, she waved them off. "Just do the same for someone else," she'd say. "That's how it's supposed to work." Zerth realized then that Andrea didn't protect her for gratitude. She did it because it was the right thing to do, not for fame, not for power, but for balance. Predators stood still. The rest of the galaxy had learned to flee. Humans had learned when not to. And somewhere deep in her crystalline heart, Zerth began to understand why the stars had called them. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the oldest. But when the universe turned cruel, humans didn't look away. They stood. And sometimes, standing was enough to change everything. Whispers travel faster than light on Kepler Station. By the time the next rotation dawned, everyone had heard about the human girl who dropped a drool twice her size without breaking a sweat. They said she moved like gravity had remembered her name. They said her eyes never blinked. Some even said she smiled afterward, not in triumph, but in warning. Andrea didn't care about the rumors. She went to class, took her notes, ran her lab assignments, and kept showing up exactly as before. But the corridors had changed. The silence that used to suffocate Zerth now felt different, watchful instead of cruel. The predators of the academy, the self-proclaimed apex species, had felt a shift they couldn't explain. The fragile beings they used to ignore now walked with their heads higher. The drool no longer filled the halls with laughter. The Kryn, with their armored pride, muttered privately about human unpredictability. Even the Thoraxians, lovers of efficiency, began recording footage of human combat methods for academic analysis. Zerth noticed everything. She noticed how Andrea's presence turned corners into safe zones. She noticed how other Velcari began sitting closer to humans in the cafeteria. She noticed how her own voice no longer trembled when she spoke in class. At first, she thought it was gratitude. Later, she realized it was permission to exist without fear. Days passed, then weeks. The station adjusted to the new order like metal cooling after a forge. And during that time, the friendship between the Velcari and the human deepened quietly, layer by layer, like glass thickening under pressure. They spent nights in the observation dome, watching the dead moon drift below. Andrea would point out the constellations humanity had renamed after monsters and heroes. Zerth would describe the color songs of Etherian, the way her people measured time by the glow of their rivers. They traded stories. Earth storms for Etherian rainbows, human laughter for Velcari light. "You know," Andrea said once, eyes fixed on the void, "we used to look at the stars and think they were perfect, untouchable, like they were the only pure thing left." Zerth tilted her head. "And now I think perfection is overrated. It breaks too easily." Zerth smiled softly. "Then perhaps that is why we break, to remind the universe we are not perfect." Andrea looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe that's exactly why we survive." The more they spoke, the more Zerth saw the pattern. Humans weren't fearless, they were frightened all the time. But fear didn't stop them. It shaped them. On Earth, every creature had tried to kill them. The cold, the heat, the storms, even each other. And somehow, they turned fear into invention, suffering into art. One evening, Zerth finally asked the question that had lingered in her chest since the first day they met. "Why help me?" Andrea leaned back against the dome's frame. "Because someone once did it for me." Zerth waited. "When I was little," Andrea continued, "I used to get into fights. Not because I wanted to, but because someone always needed defending. My mom said it was a family curse. This need to step between the weak and the cruel. My dad called it bad impulse control. She laughed softly. I just call it being human. Zerth lowered her gaze. My people don't understand violence. Then maybe that's your strength, Andrea said. And maybe ours is understanding it, and still choosing when not to use it. For the first time, Zerth wondered if strength wasn't about claws or armor, but about decision. Weeks turned into months. The academy quieted. The morning torment stopped completely. Zerth's grades climbed. Her wings unfolded freely again, spreading rainbows across classroom walls. The sight made her professors pause mid-lecture, smiling unconsciously at the return of beauty they hadn't realized they'd missed. But peace never goes unnoticed for long. The administrative council began whispering. Reports had been filed by drool parents demanding disciplinary action. Diplomatic ambassadors from multiple species complained about unregulated human aggression. The academy couldn't ignore it forever. Andrea was summoned again. The hearing room was all glass and silver, the council crest glimmering behind the long table. 5 representatives waited: Drool, Kryn, Thoraxian, Velcari, and 1 human advisor observing silently. Andrea stood before them, hands behind her back, posture neutral. Student Andrea Lin, said the drool chairman, voice deep as thunder. You stand accused of unnecessary violence against fellow students. How do you plead? Andrea met his gaze. I don't plead. I explain. Gasps rippled through the room. She continued calmly. I used proportional force to stop an ongoing assault that had been ignored by both staff and security for months. If I hadn't intervened, you'd be holding a hearing about a death, not a bruised jaw. The Kryn representative hissed. You humans think fists solve everything. Andrea's voice didn't rise. No, but sometimes they stop worse things before they start. The Thoraxian chittered softly. Such pragmatism. Inefficient, yet effective. The drool chairman leaned forward. Do you understand what message you've sent? That violence brings respect. Andrea's expression hardened. No, I showed them that apathy brings monsters. The words hung in the air, sharp as glass. The hearing ended without a verdict. There couldn't be one. Too many species, too many interpretations of right and wrong. But something changed afterward. Surveillance increased. Anti-harassment policies were expanded. Training seminars on cultural empathy became mandatory. Zerth watched it all unfold quietly. When Andrea returned from the hearing, she asked nothing. Andrea said nothing. But between them, understanding passed like light through crystal. Life resumed. They spent more nights studying. Andrea taught Zerth human history, not just the wars, but the resilience threaded through them. The Great Fire of London, the plagues, the revolutions, every tragedy followed by rebuilding. Zerth found it paradoxical. You destroy yourselves, she said one night, and then act surprised when you survive. Andrea smiled faintly. That's how we learn. Pain is a lousy teacher, but we're stubborn students. Later, when Andrea had gone back to her dorm, Zerth stood by the viewport, staring at her reflection. For the first time, she saw something beyond fragility. She saw a light that refused to dim, even after it cracked. The next morning, she passed GRA in the corridor. He looked away first. In the weeks that followed, Andrea became a quiet legend. Not through boasting, but through silence. Other humans began to be approached by smaller species for help, advice, companionship. A drool who once bullied now asked for tutoring. A Kryn engineer requested human assistance in a group project. Cooperation replaced hierarchy, not by decree, but by imitation. Zerth realized that Andrea hadn't just protected her. She'd shifted the ecosystem. Predators adapted. Prey adapted. Balance re-emerged. But not all eyes were friendly. Beyond the academy, word of the Velcari's protector reached the Galactic Council. Some worlds found the story inspiring. Fragile races had allies now. Others found it alarming. If humans defended the weak, what would they do when threatened themselves? 1,000 discussions bloomed across the network. Scholars debated whether humans were truly empathetic or merely strategic. Military analysts studied their neural chemistry. Philosophers coined new terms: compassionate aggression, predatory altruism, the empathy paradox. Zerth ignored the politics. She had something more important, a friendship that had taught her courage. One evening, as the two studied in the quiet library, Zerth looked up from her hollow tablet. When you graduate, will you go back to Earth? Andrea shook her head. Maybe, but probably not for long. There's too much out here that needs fixing. Fixing? Andrea smiled. The galaxy's big, Zerth, and not all of its kind. Zerth hesitated. You can't fix the whole galaxy. No, Andrea said, but I can stand in one hallway at a time. Silence filled the space between them, comfortable, alive. Later that night, Zerth dreamed of wings made of glass and hands made of flesh reaching out together toward the same star. And she began to wonder if the stars themselves were watching. Because the story of a human and a Velcari had already begun echoing beyond the walls of Kepler Station, rippling through the networks, threading through transmissions, whispered in dormitories and council halls alike. It wasn't just a story about violence. It was a story about choice. About the moment a predator decided to protect instead of consume. And though the galaxy didn't yet realize it, that single decision, one girl's refusal to look away, would alter the trajectory of countless worlds. It began with a broken wing. It continued with a human hand. And before long, it would reach the stars. Rumors have gravity. On Kepler Station, they didn't just drift, they pulled. What began as whispers in a hallway became a current that reached the Galactic Council itself. The phrase that surfaced first was simple, the persistence factor. The analysts tried to define it, measure it, turn it into data. They called it a behavioral anomaly. They called it human. They examined the numbers, survival rates, mission endurance, psychological stability under duress. Every chart curved the same way. Humans bent, but didn't break. In an age where most civilizations prized predictability, this stubborn unpredictability unsettled them. At the council convocation that year, the question was officially placed on the agenda. What makes humanity impossible to categorize? The great species gathered, each sending their brightest scholars. The drool spoke of biological deficiencies. The Kryn insisted it was an evolutionary fluke. The Thoraxians, precise and mathematical, presented a chart mapping human resilience against known stress variables. The data made no sense. Where other species plateaued, humans spiked higher. Where others surrendered, humans adapted. When the debate reached the Velcari delegation, their representative, an elder named Sil Lareth, rose slowly. Her wings shimmered in quiet hues of gold. They are not the strongest, she said softly, nor the oldest, but perhaps they are the most unwilling to yield. The chamber fell silent. The words traveled far beyond the hall. They became a phrase repeated in classrooms, in military briefings, in poems. The stubborn species. Some meant it mockingly, others with awe. Meanwhile, on Kepler Station, life continued. Andrea and Zerth moved toward graduation, their friendship now a symbol in itself. Students from every world came to them with questions about cooperation, ethics, defense, diplomacy. Andrea never lectured. She simply listened and then told stories of Earth's long climb through darkness, of floods survived and empires rebuilt, of people who had chosen compassion over conquest. Zerth became her translator in more ways than one. She learned to speak human idioms fluently, even when they made little sense. When Andrea said, "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Zerth pictured an actual bridge. When Andrea muttered, "Old habits die hard," Zerth smiled sadly, thinking of her cracked wings. In return, Andrea learned the subtleties of Velcari color speech, the way emotion rippled through light. She learned that courage glowed blue at the edges, that gratitude shimmered green, that love, unspoken, burned white silver like sunrise on glass. Together, they formed something new, empathy translated across biology. One evening in the academy courtyard, a group of young Velcari approached them. Their leader, a first-year student with wings still soft from growth, said timidly, "We heard what you did last cycle. We thank you." Andrea smiled. "Don't thank me. Thank her." She nodded toward Zerth. The younger Velcari turned to their own kind, realizing for the first time that their example came not from a savior, but from one of their own who had refused to hide. After that night, Andrea and Zerth began hosting informal gatherings. Humans came. Velcari came. Even a few drool attended, awkward but curious. They called it the exchange circle. The discussions ranged from art to ethics to strategy. It was not officially sanctioned, but it became the most popular meeting on the station. For many students, it was the first time they had spoken openly without fear of hierarchy. It was the beginning of something larger, a cultural bridge built not by politicians, but by students who had simply decided to care. Years passed faster than anyone expected. Graduation arrived in a cascade of light and ceremony. The auditorium overflowed with species whose names barely fit on one plaque. When Andrea's name was called, applause thundered, but it was the quiet moment afterward that mattered most. Zerth stepped forward and wrapped her wings around her friend, a Velcari gesture reserved for family. The colors that shimmered across those wings told everyone watching that the fragile species had found strength and the predators had found peace. After commencement, they stood together by the viewport one last time. The planet below was just a shadowed marble of ice. "So," Andrea said, "Ambassador Zerth, what happens next?" Zerth smiled. "My people asked me to return. They want me to speak for us at the council, to show them we are not ornaments." Andrea nodded. "Good. They need to hear you. And you?" "The mediation corps accepted me." Andrea looked out at the stars. "They send negotiators to the worst places, war zones, failed colonies. It's messy, but someone has to stand there until everyone else stops shooting." Zerth studied her profile in the starlight. "You're still standing in hallways." Andrea's laugh was quiet. "That's all I know how to do." They didn't promise to meet again. They didn't need to. Some bonds don't fade with distance. They echo. Months later, reports began filtering back to Kepler Station. The mediation corps was performing miracles or disasters, depending on who told the story. Wherever they sent Andrea Lin, conflicts cooled. Rebel leaders surrendered. Hostages were freed. Ceasefires held. And occasionally, when negotiation failed completely, her name appeared in lines that read neutralized threat with minimal casualties. She never mentioned Kepler Station. She never mentioned Zerth. But the legend of the Velcari's protector followed her anyway, a whisper of translucent wings and a human who refused to look away. Back on Etherian, Zerth grew into her role as diplomat. Her voice carried weight at the council. She learned to weave human persistence into Velcari grace. When the old guard argued for retreat, she argued for outreach. When they called humans dangerous, she said softly, "Perhaps. But danger is not always our enemy. Sometimes it keeps the dark things away." Over the years, her speeches spread across the network, inspiring thousands of young Velcari to apply for off-world study. The fragile species no longer hid their light. They carried it outward. And across countless systems, the phrase "humans protect their own," and sometimes others too, became a proverb. When Andrea and Zerth met again, it was by accident. A diplomatic conference on Proxima Relay 12. They spotted each other across the hall. Andrea in the uniform of the mediation corps, Zerth in flowing crystalline attire. For a heartbeat, the years between them vanished. Andrea saluted. Zerth laughed and did it back. Neither needed words. Later that evening, they shared a quiet meal overlooking the alien city. Andrea told stories of border disputes and pirate truces. Zerth spoke of art exhibitions and treaties. They both fell silent at the same moment, realizing that everything they had built, every ripple that had reached the stars, had started in one forgotten corridor. Zerth said, "Do you ever miss the academy?" "Sometimes," Andrea said. "Mostly the quiet after a fight." "You mean the peace?" Andrea looked out at the horizon. "Peace is just the moment you decide to keep standing." That line would later be engraved on monuments, though Andrea never knew it. Years rolled on. Empires shifted, alliances rose and fell, but the memory of those early human interactions remained fixed in galactic culture. Universities analyzed the Kepler phenomenon, the sudden drop in interspecies bullying, the measurable increase in cooperative learning following the incident. They wrote papers. They held symposiums. They tried to explain what had happened in scientific terms. But every Velcari knew the truth couldn't be graphed. It lived in the space between fear and courage, in the decision to act. By the time Zerth reached her later years, she had become one of the most respected ambassadors in the council. Young delegates sought her mentorship. She always told them the same story, not about politics, but about a human girl in a corridor of light. "It was not her strength that changed us," she would say. "It was her refusal to look away." When Andrea's ship docked on Etherian decades later, there were no cameras waiting. Just a quiet, welcoming committee and an old friend with luminous wings. They spent 3 days together, walking through gardens of singing trees and watching the rivers glow at night. Andrea's hair was threaded with gray now, but her eyes were still the same, focused, forward, fierce. On the last evening, as the twin moons rose, Zerth said softly, "My mother once told me gentleness was our greatest power. I think she was wrong." Andrea smiled. She was half right. Gentleness needs teeth. Zerth laughed, the sound like chimes. "And you humans have both." When Andrea left, she carried a gift, a single translucent feather scale from Zerth's wing, suspended in a protective sphere of light. She kept it in her cabin until the end of her days. Long after both women were gone, historians would trace entire diplomatic doctrines back to their friendship. The compassion paradox became required reading. Cadets memorized the quote that summed it up best: "When predators learn empathy, the universe gains a guardian." And though the Council would never admit it openly, the reason humans were given mediator status across the galaxy came down to one unrecorded event on a school corridor where a fragile girl once tried to hide her wings. The rest, as the archivists would write centuries later, was inevitable. Because once a species like humanity decided that protection was sacred, the stars themselves had to learn to behave. Centuries later, long after Andrea and Zerth had passed into memory, the galaxy still carried their names like a heartbeat. Students learned the story in ethics classes. Soldiers repeated it during deployments. Diplomats quoted it in fragile negotiations. The lesson was always the same. Power was not only the ability to strike, it was the choice to stand. Kepler Station still orbited the same pale moon, rebuilt and refitted through a dozen ages. The corridors gleamed with alloy walls, new lights, new technologies. Yet beneath all the progress, one hallway remained quiet. It was the one where Zerth had once walked, where Andrea had stood her ground. A small plaque rested at the center of that corridor, unremarkable at first glance. Most hurried past it. Some paused long enough to read the inscription in both human and Velcari script. "All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Dedicated to those who stand." Generations of students had walked by those words. Some barely noticed. Others whispered the story. And every few years, one would stop, straighten, and walk forward a little taller. For most of the galaxy, the plaque was history. For a few, it was prophecy. Because peace, as Andrea once said, is only the moment you decide to keep standing. That truth was tested again during the Zorati raids. The Zorati were pirates without allegiance, scattered fleets of scavengers and mercenaries who struck where law was thin. They were efficient, merciless, and they moved like storms. They looted colonies, burned outposts, and left silence behind. Even the Council, proud of its long peace, struggled to contain them. When the first wave of Zorati ships appeared near the Kepler sector, most assumed the station was safe. It was a symbol, not a target. But symbols attract attention. They remind the desperate and the angry of what they cannot destroy inside themselves. The attack began at dawn cycle. The alarms howled through the corridors. Students scattered. The defense grid failed within hours. Kepler Station had grown complacent. No one had expected real war. By midday, the Zorati boarding pods were carving through the hull. Among the visitors that week was a familiar figure. Zerth, older now, her wings no longer radiant silver but deep opal, had returned as a guest ambassador. She was meeting with new recruits, telling stories of the early integration days. When the lights flickered and the sirens blared, she froze for half a heartbeat. Then she remembered the old corridor, the one that had defined her life. She ran there, gathering a handful of students on the way. The same kind of students she once had been, scared, uncertain, clutching at data tablets as if information could stop bullets. She guided them to the far end of the hallway, sealing the bulkhead doors. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the walls. She pressed a trembling hand to the cold metal and whispered, "Not again." For an hour they waited, breathing the recycled air, listening to the station shudder. And then, through the static of the intercom, a voice cut through, clear, controlled, unmistakably human. "This is the Galactic Mediation Corps. Evacuation in progress. Hold your position. We're coming for you." Zerth's heart stilled. That voice was older, rougher, but she knew it. "Andrea." She laughed once, breathless. The students stared. "You know her?" one asked. Zerth smiled. "I did. A long time ago." The bulkhead shook as the pirates breached the outer ring. The door hissed open, and the Zorati poured through, tall, armor-plated, wielding weapons meant for conquest. They saw fragile beings huddled at the end of the hall and laughed. Then the laughter stopped, because standing in front of the group, blocking the path completely, was a single human in the dark uniform of the Mediation Corps, holding a sidearm in one hand and something far heavier in her stance: history. Andrea Lin hadn't aged like most humans. Decades of service had carved her face with lines of endurance, not fragility. Her eyes were still forward-facing, still focused. Predator's eyes, trained now by experience. She spoke calmly. "This corridor is under protection. Leave your weapons and walk away." The Zorati leader snarled, raising his blaster. "One human, one weapon. We are not afraid." Andrea sighed. "You should be." The next moments unfolded like a memory of that first fight so long ago. Only now every movement was honed, measured, inevitable. The human didn't charge. She moved through the space the way wind finds cracks in stone. 2 shots. A pivot. A strike with the edge of the weapon. A disarm. A sweep. The pirates dropped in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, each rendered harmless before they realized they'd lost. The students watched in stunned silence. Zerth watched with tears in her eyes. This was the same girl who once said she didn't know how to do anything except stand in hallways. She was still doing it. And she was still winning. When the last pirate fell, Andrea turned to the group. Everyone intact. A dozen heads nodded. Zerth stepped forward, wings trembling. "You never change," she whispered. Andrea smiled, weary but bright. "Neither do you." Later, when reinforcements finally arrived, the news feeds swarmed with questions. The official reports said the human negotiator had held off a pirate unit long enough for evacuation, preventing casualties and preserving the station. When a reporter asked how she'd done it, Andrea just shrugged. "Same way we always do. We stand our ground." The image of her standing amid the fallen pirates became an icon. The council replayed it endlessly, dissecting her technique, her composure, her restraint. But what the cameras couldn't capture was the silence afterward. The way she looked at Zerth with quiet recognition, as if to say, "See, the lesson was never just mine." Zerth would later recount that moment to her grandchildren. "She didn't save me," she'd tell them. "She reminded me that I could save myself." Andrea's service continued for years after. She became a legend within the Corps, not because she fought, but because she prevented others from needing to. Her record listed more successful de-escalations than any other officer. She never sought command. She never wrote memoirs. She just kept showing up where she was needed. And then, quietly, she was gone. A final mission into a border dispute that ended in peace but cost her ship's return. No wreckage, no signal. Only the echo of her last message: "Hold your ground. Help is coming." The council honored her with silence. The Velcari honored her with song. Zerth lived long enough to see that song performed. An opera of light and color, its title translated roughly as "The Light Beneath Fragile Wings." It told the story of 2 students, a bully, and a hallway that became a symbol for an entire species awakening. When the final note faded, the audience sat in reverent stillness before erupting into applause that shook the crystalline towers of Ethereum. And so the legend of Andrea Lin crossed into myth. Centuries later, the galaxy would change beyond recognition. Species rose, merged, disappeared. New technologies replaced the old. The council became something different, and then something else again. But through every transformation, the story endured. Academy still told it, not as history, but as ethics. The compassion paradox, scholars called it, the phenomenon of a species evolved for predation choosing, again and again, to protect instead. Students debated it endlessly. How could creatures designed for hunting also create symphonies? How could those capable of such violence prefer peace? The Velcari philosophers offered the simplest answer. Because the same eyes that once tracked prey learned to look upward. And that upward gaze, they said, was humanity's truest inheritance. By the 10th century after Andrea's death, the hallway on Kepler Station had become a pilgrimage site. Cadets visited it before deployments. Diplomats walked it before negotiations. Even pirates, those who now served as peacekeepers after the Reformation, came to stand there in silence. The plaque remained unchanged, its metal polished by countless hands. On one particular dawn cycle, a new arrival paused before it. A young human cadet in the same uniform Andrea once wore. At her side stood a Velcari student, wings faintly luminescent, nervous but smiling. The cadet read the inscription aloud, softly. All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. She looked at her friend. Guess that still works. The Velcari tilted her head. Do you think it's true? The human nodded. Only one way to find out. They walked on together toward their first class, unaware that the surveillance cameras above had recorded the moment, just as it had recorded another pair centuries before. History, it seemed, liked to repeat itself, not because it forgot, but because it hoped someone would remember. Somewhere deep in the archives of Etherian, a librarian cataloging ancient transmissions stumbled upon a damaged file, an old audio log, time-stamped from a mediation core. The voice was faint, but clear enough to transcribe. To whoever hears this, the universe doesn't get better by accident. Someone has to show up. Someone has to stand. The librarian smiled, archived the file, and added a note. Origin uncertain. Probable human source. The file became a devotional recording among the Velcari youth, recited before they embarked on new expeditions. They called it simply the Oath of Standing. And thus the legacy continued, not in battles or treaties, but in the quiet choices of ordinary beings who refused to look away. Because the story of Andrea and Zerth was never about a single act of defiance. It was about endurance. It was about how empathy, once kindled, could outlast centuries. It was about the paradox that the fiercest protectors in the galaxy were those who once had every reason to destroy. It was about what it means to be human, even when you're not. And as long as the plaque remained, as long as the corridor held its silent light, the lesson endured. Stand up, show up, never back down. Because that, in the end, is how stars are made.